want to just take a moment to share with you just a miraculous story of God's provision for Merriman Road Church. Now, I grew up here as a child and a teen in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Our church had two buildings. We had a worship sanctuary, and then there was space in between, and then we had an educational building. And that was fine, except when weather wasn't good, and you had your nursery over on one side, and you had your worship center on the other. You'd drop your kids off. You have to put your coat back on and come over to the worship center for worship. But we put up with it because we had been told for many years that we had no choice, that this space was an easement. There were power poles that ran through this easement, and we didn't own it, so we would never be able to build on it. When I came to serve as pastor in 98, in just a few years, the church had grown in such a way that we knew we needed to expand. We needed more space. There was no fellowship space. There was a very, very little growing space for new classes. And so we began praying about it, began talking about it, but finding a way past this obstacle was difficult. One Sunday night, I was preaching, and after the service had already begun, there was a couple that came in and sat towards the back of the sanctuary. After the service, I was standing at the doors of the sanctuary, and I met the couple, talked with them briefly, and we were chatting about what he did. Kind of normal conversation. He told me he worked for DTE, the power company. And I said, hey, can I show you something? So we stepped out of the church, stepped into this space. I pointed up to the power lines running through. And I told him, I said, we've always been told that we would never be able to bring these buildings together because of this easement. It's owned by DTE. And I just wondered if you could check that out for me. He called me back a few days later, and he said, well, I've got some news for you. Some good, some bad. Which do you want first? And I said, well, I want it both, so you can start with the bad if you want to. He said, well, the bad news is if we deed this property over to you, which we can do, that's the good news. The bad news is it's going to cost a lot of money, maybe $300,000, $400,000, because we're going to have to reroute the power lines. I said, well, that's good news, really. I mean, it says it's possible. So what's the next step? He said, well, the next step is we'd have to send it to the engineers. They'd have to lay out the grid, figure out how to make it happen, and then we'd let you know what it would cost. I said, well, let's do that. 2 weeks later, he gives me a call. He says, are you sitting down? I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to be bad. I said, what's the story? What's going to happen? He says, well, when the engineers laid out the grid, they discovered that there was a duplication on your property, which meant we don't need those lines to run through there. We can cut it off at both ends of your property and just deed it over to you. It won't cost you anything. And we said, praise the Lord. That was what we were praying for. When we were praying that we could bring the building back together, we weren't really praying that we could do it without having to pay for the land. But God made the provision. And this, as we remember that, we remember He is faithful to meet our needs. That enabled us then to take steps towards the building of what is our atrium now, the connecting of the buildings, and the educational space that we were able to add just for our family life. And we recognize it as a gift from God, and we thank Him for it.